Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where winter kills without mercy, Jake Morrison lived alone by choice. 20 years of solitude in his remote cabin had taught him that survival meant trusting no one, especially not the wildlife that could tear a man apart in seconds. But on this bone-chilling February morning, something was different. A massive grey wolf lay dying on his doorstep, her 3 tiny cubs whimpering beside her motionless body. Blood stained the fresh snow, and her amber eyes held a desperate plea that cut straight through Jake's hardened heart. What no one knew was that Jake Morrison wasn't just any mountain man. He was Dr. Jake Morrison, a former veterinarian who'd fled civilization after losing everything in a malpractice lawsuit that destroyed his career and his family. For 2 decades, he'd sworn off helping anything with a heartbeat. Now, staring at this dying mother and her helpless babies, Jake faced an impossible choice: save them and risk exposing the secret that could send him to prison, or let them die and lose the last piece of his humanity forever. But what Jake decided to do next would shock even himself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's weathered hands trembled as he knelt beside the wolf. The morning wind cut through his flannel shirt, but the cold wasn't what made him shake. It was the memory of another pair of dying eyes, Sarah's golden retriever, Max, bleeding out on his examination table while his daughter screamed his name. The mother wolf's breathing was shallow, labored. A deep gash along her flank suggested a territorial fight, possibly with a mountain lion. Her cubs, no more than 8 weeks old, pressed against her cooling body, their tiny whimpers piercing the mountain silence. Jake stood abruptly, backing toward his cabin door. "Not my problem," he muttered, the words forming white puffs in the frigid air. Survival of the fittest, nature's way. But his feet wouldn't carry him inside. Instead, he found himself crouching again, his trained eye assessing the wound. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but infection would set in soon. The cubs were already showing signs of hypothermia, lethargy, shallow breathing. Without intervention, all 4 would be dead by nightfall. 20 years, Jake whispered to himself. 20 years of staying hidden. The smallest cub, a female with distinctive white markings on her chest, crawled toward him. Her tiny paws left delicate prints in the snow as she collapsed just inches from his boots. She looked up at him with eyes that hadn't yet changed from puppy blue to wolf gold, and something inside Jake's chest cracked. He scooped up the cub, feeling her fragile ribs through matted fur. She was barely alive, her body temperature dangerously low. The other 2 cubs, both males, were in slightly better condition, but not by much. Jake's mind raced through the implications. If he helped them and word got out, questions would be asked. His carefully constructed identity as a simple mountain hermit would crumble. The authorities would discover that Dr. Jake Morrison, who'd supposedly died in a hiking accident 20 years ago, was very much alive. The family of the dog that had died under his care, a case involving alleged negligence and a settlement that had bankrupted him, would demand answers he'd never been able to give. But looking at the mother wolf's fading eyes, Jake saw something that stopped his spiral of fear. Trust. Against every instinct, this wild creature had brought her babies to him, a human, a natural enemy. Somehow she'd known he was different. "Damn it," Jake cursed, his decision made. He gathered the smallest cub in one arm and reached for the mother wolf. She was massive, easily 90 pounds, but Jake's years of mountain living had kept him strong. With tremendous effort, he managed to drag her toward his cabin door while keeping the cub secure. The other 2 cubs followed, stumbling through the snow on unsteady legs. Jake kicked open his door and pulled the mother wolf inside, immediately feeling the blessed warmth of his wood-burning stove. His cabin was sparse but functional, a single room with a kitchen area, a bed in the corner, and shelves lined with books on everything from wilderness survival to, hidden behind volumes of poetry, veterinary medicine. Jake cleared his kitchen table with one sweep of his arm, sending coffee cups and yesterday's newspaper crashing to the floor. With gentle but practiced movements, he lifted the mother wolf onto the table. Her eyes followed him as he moved to a trunk beneath his bed, withdrawing supplies he'd hoped never to use again: surgical instruments, antibiotics, suture materials, all carefully maintained despite his vows, as if some part of him had always known this day would come. The cubs huddled together by the stove, their whimpering the only sound besides the crackling fire and their mother's labored breathing. Jake pulled on latex gloves and approached the examination table, his hands steady now, muscle memory overriding 20 years of self-imposed exile from his calling. "Okay, girl," he whispered to the wolf. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that Marcus had grown to treasure over his 15 years in these mountains. But as he stepped onto his porch that morning, coffee steaming in the frigid air, that silence shattered like glass against stone. A low whimper, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles, stopped him cold. Marcus set his mug on the wooden railing and scanned the tree line, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. Old habits died hard, even after all these years of self-imposed exile. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere near the base of the porch steps. Marcus descended slowly, his boots crunching through the fresh powder, and froze at what he found. A grey wolf lay collapsed against the wooden foundation, her flanks heaving with labored breaths. Dark blood had seeped through her thick coat, staining the snow beneath her in spreading crimson patches. But what made Marcus's breath catch weren't her wounds. It was the 3 tiny forms huddled against her belly, mewling softly as they sought warmth from their dying mother. The she-wolf's amber eyes found his, and in them he saw something that cut through him like a blade, desperate, unwavering trust. She had brought her cubs here, to his doorstep, in her final moments. Somehow she had chosen him. Marcus knelt in the snow, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that sudden movements could mean death. The wolf didn't flinch as he approached, though every survival instinct should have screamed at her to flee from human contact. Instead, she lifted her great head slightly and looked from her cubs to Marcus, the message clear as spoken words. "Easy, Mama," Marcus whispered, his voice rusty from months of disuse. "I've got them." The cubs were impossibly small, their eyes barely open, fur still downy soft. 2 were grey like their mother, but the third was pure black with a distinctive white mark across its chest, a mark that stirred something deep in Marcus's memory, something he'd buried alongside his former life. The mother wolf shuddered once, then went still. Marcus watched the light fade from her amber eyes and felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. Death was nothing new to him. He'd seen more than his share in places whose names were classified and whose existence was officially denied. But this felt different. This felt like a choice, a trust given freely rather than extracted by force. He gathered the cubs carefully, their tiny bodies barely filling his cupped palms. They were cold, too cold, and growing weaker by the moment without their mother's warmth. Marcus had delivered aid in war zones, had performed field medicine under impossible conditions, but keeping 3 wolf cubs alive was beyond any training the government had given him. Inside his cabin, Marcus worked with methodical precision. He built up the fire until the main room blazed with warmth, then fashioned a makeshift den from an old wooden crate lined with his softest flannel shirts. The cubs huddled together, their tiny whimpers growing fainter as hypothermia threatened to claim them. Marcus rummaged through his emergency supplies until he found a small bottle of honey and a medicine dropper. He'd read once that honey mixed with warm water could sustain orphaned animals in the short term. Whether that applied to wolf cubs, he had no idea, but doing nothing meant watching them die. The black cub with the white mark was the weakest, barely responsive, when Marcus carefully parted its tiny jaws and squeezed a few drops of the honey solution onto its tongue. But after several tense minutes, the cub swallowed, then mewed plaintively for more. As he worked to feed each cub, Marcus tried to push down the memories that the black one's distinctive markings had awakened. 20 years ago, in the mountains of Afghanistan, he'd encountered another wolf with similar coloring. That wolf had saved his life and the lives of his entire unit, leading them away from a Taliban ambush that should have killed them all. Intelligence reports later suggested that wolves in that region had been part of an old Soviet genetics program, animals bred for enhanced intelligence and loyalty. Marcus shook his head, dismissing the thought as paranoid fantasy. These were ordinary cubs, orphaned by winter's cruelty and delivered to him by chance, nothing more. But as he watched the black cub respond to his ministrations with what seemed like unusual awareness, those old questions resurfaced. Questions about experiments that officially never happened, about programs that were supposedly terminated, about genetic markers that could skip generations before manifesting. The cub opened its eyes then, and Marcus felt his breath catch. They weren't the blue-gray of most newborn wolves, but a startling green that seemed almost to glow in the firelight. The same impossible green he'd seen in those Afghan mountains all those years ago. Marcus leaned back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever he'd stumbled into, whatever these cubs really were, his life of carefully maintained isolation had just ended. The cubs had fallen silent in the crate, their tiny bodies pressed together in exhausted slumber. Marcus found himself checking on them every few minutes, listening for the soft wheeze of their breathing. The larger one, a male with distinctive white markings on his chest, had eaten more aggressively, while his smaller sister remained cautious, watching Marcus with intelligent yellow eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. Outside, the storm had intensified. Wind howled through the valley, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spiraling past in ghostly sheets. Marcus had weathered countless storms in these mountains, but tonight felt different. The mother wolf's body lay beneath a tarp on his porch, waiting for morning when he could give her a proper burial. Every gust of wind seemed to carry her final desperate whimper. He tried to return to his usual evening routine, checking his weather instruments, updating his journal, preparing for another long night alone. But concentration proved impossible. The cubs stirred occasionally, making small sounds that tugged at something buried deep in his chest, something he'd thought was permanently sealed away. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, staring at the unfamiliar weight of it in his hands. He'd purchased it 3 years ago for emergencies, but had never found a reason compelling enough to use it. Now he scrolled through the limited contacts, his thumb hovering over a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 15 years. Dr. Sarah Chen, wildlife veterinarian, former colleague, former friend, the last person who might understand what he was dealing with, and the last person he wanted to contact. Their final conversation had ended with accusations, betrayal, and a door slammed so hard it still echoed in his memory. But the cubs needed professional care, and his pride seemed insignificant compared to their survival. Before he could reconsider, he pressed the call button. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, cautious and professional. "Dr. Chen speaking. Sarah, it's Marcus." The words felt foreign on his tongue. A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice carried a mixture of shock and something that might have been relief. "Marcus Thorne, I wondered if you were still alive up there." "Barely." He glanced toward the cubs. "I need your help. It's not about me. There are 2 wolf cubs, maybe 3 weeks old. Their mother died bringing them to me. I don't know why she chose my cabin, but she did, and now they're my responsibility." "Wolf cubs?" Sarah's tone shifted to clinical interest. "In this storm, where exactly are you?" Marcus provided his coordinates, hearing Sarah's sharp intake of breath when she realized how remote his location was. "Jesus, Marcus, you're completely cut off. The roads won't be passable for days, maybe longer with this weather system." "I know. That's why I'm calling. I need to know how to keep them alive until help can reach us." "What's their condition?" Marcus described everything he'd observed. Their size, behavior, appetite, the way they responded to his presence. Sarah listened without interruption, and he could almost see her mentally cataloguing the information just as she had during their research days. "You're doing better than I expected," she admitted, "but there are complications you haven't considered. Wolf cubs imprint quickly, especially orphan ones. If they bond with you as a parent figure, reintegrating them into the wild becomes exponentially more difficult." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you might be making a choice with consequences that extend far beyond tonight. These cubs could become your responsibility for years, not days. And Marcus," her voice grew softer, "given your history, given what happened with the research project, maybe you should consider whether you're the right person to make that choice." The reference to his past sent a familiar spike of anger through his chest. "My history has nothing to do with this, doesn't it? You've been hiding in those mountains for 15 years because of what went wrong, because of what you discovered about predator-human bonding, about the psychological changes that occur when natural boundaries are crossed. You know better than anyone how dangerous this could become." Marcus watched the cubs sleeping peacefully, unaware of the forces aligning around their fate. "These are babies, Sarah. Helpless animals who need care, nothing more. That's what we thought about Subject 7, remember? Right up until everything went to hell." The mention of Subject 7 hit Marcus like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, fighting back memories of amber eyes, of intelligence that shouldn't have been possible, of a connection that had changed everything he thought he knew about the natural world. "This is different," he said quietly. "Is it? Or are you about to repeat the same mistakes that destroyed your career and nearly got people killed?" Outside, the wind screamed through the peaks with renewed fury, as if the mountains themselves were warning him away from the path ahead. But when the smaller cub whimpered softly in her sleep, Marcus felt his resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. "Tell me how to keep them alive, Sarah. Everything else is my problem." The mother wolf died just before dawn. Marcus found her body still curled protectively around the wooden crate he'd fashioned for the cubs, her massive head resting against the rough pine boards. Even in death, she maintained her vigil. The 3 surviving cubs, one had succumbed during the night despite his efforts, pressed against her cooling fur, whimpering softly. He knelt beside her, placing a weathered hand on her flank. "You did good, Mama," he whispered. "I'll keep my word." The burial took most of the morning. Marcus chose a spot on the ridge overlooking his cabin, where the first rays of sunlight broke through the pines. As he shoveled the last of the earth over her grave, memories clawed at him like phantom wolves. Afghanistan, the compound, children's voices cut short by gunfire. He'd failed to protect them then, but these cubs, these he could save. Back at the cabin, the 3 survivors huddled in their makeshift den. The largest, a female with distinctive white markings around her eyes, had already shown signs of dominance. The 2 males were smaller, weaker. One bore a striking resemblance to his mother with his silver-tipped coat, while the other was nearly black with amber eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young creature. Marcus had read about wolf rehabilitation, but theory and practice were vastly different beasts. The cubs needed milk every few hours, but the goat's milk substitute he'd prepared was barely keeping them alive. Their mother's antibodies were gone now, leaving them vulnerable to every pathogen the wilderness could offer. He was mixing another batch of formula when the sound of an approaching helicopter shattered the mountain silence. Marcus froze, his blood turning to ice water. Through the kitchen window, he watched the black aircraft circle his property once before landing in the clearing he used for supply drops. 3 figures emerged. Even at this distance, Marcus recognized the purposeful gait of military personnel. His past had found him. "Shit," he muttered, securing the cubs in their crate and covering it with a heavy tarp. Whatever this was about, he couldn't let them discover the wolves. Not yet. The knock came 5 minutes later, sharp, authoritative raps that demanded immediate attention. Marcus opened the door to find 2 men in dark suits, flanked by a woman in army fatigues. The woman stepped forward, her steel-grey hair pulled back severely, her pale eyes cataloguing every detail of his appearance. "Marcus Chen," she said. It wasn't a question. "Colonel Hayes." He kept his voice neutral despite the recognition flooding through him. It's been a long time. 12 years, 7 months. She studied his scarred hands, the beard that couldn't quite hide the burn marks along his jaw. May we come in? Depends what you want. One of the suits, a thin man with nervous energy, shifted impatiently. Mr. Chen, we represent a joint task force investigating unusual biological phenomena. We have reason to believe you might have information relevant to our inquiries. From inside the cabin came a soft whimper. Marcus coughed loudly, hoping to mask the sound. Don't know what kind of information a hermit like me could have. Hayes smiled, but it held no warmth. The kind that involves your particular expertise with genetics and animal behavior. The kind that might explain why satellite thermal imaging shows unusual heat signatures around your property. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. They knew something, but how much? Thermal signatures could be anything. Bears, deer, elk. Could be. The second suit, older and more seasoned, pulled out a tablet. But these signatures show pack behavior, coordinated movement patterns, and they appeared roughly 72 hours ago. Another whimper from inside, louder this time. Hayes cocked her head, her expression sharpening. What was that? Wind in the chimney. Marcus lied smoothly. Old cabin settles a lot. The nervous suit was already moving toward the door. We'd like to take a look around, if you don't mind. Marcus blocked his path. Actually, I do mind. This is private property, and unless you have a warrant... We don't need a warrant, Hayes interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Not for you. Not after what happened in Kandahar. The name hit him like a physical blow. Kandahar. The failed mission. The children who died because of his hubris, his belief that he could play God with genetics and create super soldiers. The project that had cost him everything. His career, his reputation, his family. That was classified, he said through gritted teeth. Classifications have a way of becoming declassified when national security is at stake. Hayes pushed past him into the cabin, especially when rogue scientists with a history of illegal genetic experimentation suddenly attract the attention of our monitoring systems. The cubs chose that moment to cry out in unison, a desperate, hungry wail that echoed through the cabin's main room. Hayes froze, her head snapping toward the sound. The two suits flanked her, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. Well, Hayes said softly, this just got very interesting. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the last of his peaceful isolation crumble around him. The rifle felt foreign in Marcus's hands as he stepped onto the porch, dawn's pale light casting long shadows through the pines. 3 days had passed since he'd buried the mother wolf, and the cubs were finally strong enough to venture outside. They tumbled around his boots like oversized puppies, their blue eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. He should have felt relieved. The plan was simple. Lead them deep into the wilderness, far from human contact, and let nature reclaim them. It was the logical choice, the safe choice. Yet something twisted in his gut as he watched the smallest cub, the one he'd privately named Ghost for her pale markings, nuzzle against his leg with complete trust. The satellite phone's shrill ring shattered the morning quiet. Marcus froze, his blood turning to ice. Only 3 people had this number, and 2 of them were dead. Kane. The voice was crisp, military. Director Sarah Chen of the Biological Warfare Division. We need to talk. Marcus said nothing, his finger hovering over the disconnect button. The satellite picked up unusual thermal signatures at your location 3 nights ago, Chen continued. Wolves, Marcus, in your exact coordinates. After 12 years of radio silence. That's quite a coincidence. The cubs sensed his tension, pressing closer to his legs. Ghost whimpered softly. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Of course you don't. Chen's laugh was cold. But I think you'd be interested to know that Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's research has been declassified. Posthumously, of course. Turns out her theories about genetic memory and accelerated evolution weren't so crazy after all. Marcus closed his eyes. Beth. Even now, 12 years later, her name was a blade between his ribs. The Morrison protocol has been refined, Chen continued. We've had some remarkable breakthroughs. The applications for military enhancement are extraordinary. But we need a test subject with the right genetic markers, someone from the original program. The program is dead, Marcus said through gritted teeth. You made sure of that. Phase 1 is dead. Phase 2 requires a more organic approach. Those wolves that definitely aren't at your location, their genetic structure would be invaluable, as would the expertise of our only surviving subject. The line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone, his hands shaking. The cubs milled around him, oblivious to the threat that had just descended upon them like a net. He thought of the facility, of the things they'd done in the name of science, of Beth's horrified face when she realized what her research had created, of the fire that had supposedly destroyed everything. But Chen was right. The wolves weren't ordinary. The mother's behavior, the cubs' rapid development, the way they seemed to understand his emotions. Even now he could feel their heartbeats, smell their scents with impossible clarity. The changes in himself that he'd attributed to mountain living were something else entirely. A distant thrum reached his ears. Helicopters, still miles away but closing fast. Marcus cursed and scooped up the cubs, their small bodies warm against his chest. Ghost licked his chin with a tiny pink tongue, and the gesture nearly broke him. He had perhaps 30 minutes before Chen's team arrived. 30 minutes to decide whether to run or surrender, to fight or disappear forever. The logical choice was clear. Take the cubs into the deep wilderness, travel light and fast, stay ahead of the search teams until they gave up or winter forced them to retreat. He knew these mountains better than anyone. He could survive. But as he looked down at the 3 small faces trusting him completely, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Purpose, not the cold, calculated mission parameters of his old life, but something warmer, something worth protecting. The helicopter sounds grew louder. Marcus made his choice. He set the cubs down gently and knelt beside them. "Listen to me," he whispered, not caring how insane it was to speak to them like they could understand. "We're going to play a game. You need to be very quiet, very still. Can you do that for me?" 3 sets of blue eyes watched him intently. Ghost tilted her head, and for a moment Marcus could swear he saw understanding flicker in her gaze. Moving quickly, he gathered supplies, not for flight, but for siege. The cabin had been chosen for more than its isolation. The basement held secrets Chen's people couldn't imagine. Equipment Beth had helped him hide before the fire, before everything went to hell. As he loaded ammunition and activated long-dormant security systems, Marcus caught his reflection in a blackened window. For just an instant, his eyes flashed yellow in the dim light, a genetic ghost he'd thought buried forever. The helicopters were close now, their rotors beating against the mountain silence like mechanical hearts. Marcus smiled grimly and chambered around. Chen wanted a test subject. She was about to get one. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Marcus carried the weakest cub back toward the cabin. Rain lashed against his weathered face, each drop feeling like ice against his skin. The cub whimpered in his arms, its breathing shallow and rapid. Behind him, the other 2 cubs struggled to keep pace, their small paws slipping on the increasingly muddy trail. He should have seen this coming. The mother's condition when she'd arrived, the way she'd looked at him with those knowing eyes. She'd been asking him to do more than just feed her young. She'd been asking him to save them. Thunder rolled across the valley as Marcus pushed through the cabin door. The cubs scattered to the warmth of the fireplace while he gently placed the sick one on a blanket near the hearth. Its eyes were glassy, unfocused. He'd seen that look before, in another time, another place. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Afghanistan. The village outside Kandahar. A child, no more than 7, with the same glassy stare. Marcus had been a different person then. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, Special Operations, a man who followed orders without question, until that day when everything changed. He shook his head violently, forcing the memory back into its locked box. This wasn't then. These weren't children caught in a war zone. These were wild animals, and he was just a man trying to survive his own ghosts. But as he knelt beside the dying cub, another memory surfaced. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the geneticist who'd worked with his unit on Project Fenrir. Her voice echoed in his mind. The boundary between human and animal consciousness isn't as fixed as we think, Marcus. What we've discovered could change everything we understand about intelligence, about adaptation, about survival itself. The cub's breathing grew more labored. Without thinking, Marcus placed his hand on its small chest, feeling the erratic heartbeat beneath his palm. The touch triggered something, a flash of sensation that wasn't quite memory, wasn't quite dream. For a split second he could swear he felt what the cub was feeling: fear, cold, the desperate need for safety. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding. It had to be his imagination. The isolation, the guilt, the constant replaying of events he couldn't change. They were finally driving him over the edge. The other two cubs had crept closer, watching him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The larger one, the female he'd started thinking of as Scout, tilted her head as if asking a question. The smaller male pressed against his leg, a gesture that felt less like animal behavior and more like trust. Outside, the storm intensified. Marcus knew they wouldn't survive another night in the wild, not in this weather, not in their condition. He also knew that keeping them much longer was dangerous, for them and for him. Wild wolves didn't belong in cabins, and men with his past didn't belong anywhere near innocent creatures. But as he looked down at the sick cub, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the way the firelight played across its fur, or maybe it was the memory of Elena's research, but he found himself remembering things he'd tried to forget. The experiments, the breakthroughs, the terrible price they'd all paid for knowledge that was never meant to exist. The cub's eyes fluttered open, meeting his gaze. For a moment, it stretched far too long, Marcus felt that same impossible connection, a bridge of understanding that defied everything he thought he knew about the world. "I know what you are," he whispered, the words coming from somewhere deep and unplanned. "Or what you could become." Scout's ears perked up at his voice, and she moved closer, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight. There was something in her expression that made Marcus's breath catch. Recognition, as if she understood not just his words, but their meaning. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass in violent patterns. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. He was projecting human traits onto animals because of his guilt, his loneliness, his desperate need for connection after years of self-imposed exile. The cubs were wolves, nothing more. But the scientist in him, the part that had worked alongside Elena before everything went wrong, recognized the signs. Enhanced neural development, accelerated learning patterns, behavioral adaptations that shouldn't exist in nature. The sick cub struggled to lift its head, looking directly at him. In that gaze, Marcus saw something that chilled him to the bone: awareness. Not the simple consciousness of an animal, but something deeper, more complex. Thunder crashed overhead, and in its echo, Marcus heard Elena's final words to him. "If you ever find them, Marcus, the ones that survived, you'll have to choose. Will you run from what we created, or will you finally accept the responsibility for what we unleashed?" The answer, he realized with dawning horror and wonder, might not be his to make anymore. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every sound. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, watching the three cubs tumble through the powder in his backyard, their playful yips cutting through the morning air. 6 weeks had passed since their mother died, and they had grown considerably, their legs longer, their movements more coordinated, yet still endearingly clumsy. He sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth doing little to ease the knot in his stomach. The satellite phone sat heavy in his jacket pocket, Dr. Sarah Chen's number already programmed in. The wildlife biologist had left 3 voicemails over the past week, each one more urgent than the last. Reports of missing livestock had reached the state wildlife department. Rangers were asking questions. Someone had spotted wolf tracks near the old logging road. The largest cub, the one Marcus had taken to calling Shadow for his dark coat, suddenly stopped playing and lifted his head, ears pricked forward. The other two froze instantly, following their brother's gaze toward the tree line. Marcus set down his mug and reached for the binoculars hanging by the window. Three figures emerged from the forest, moving with the deliberate caution of people who knew they were trespassing. Marcus's blood ran cold as he recognized the lead figure, Tom Bradley, the local sheriff, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him walked Dr. Chen, her red parka stark against the white landscape, and a man Marcus didn't recognize carrying what looked like tranquilizer equipment. The cubs had vanished, melting into the underbrush with an instinct that both impressed and terrified Marcus. Their survival skills were developing faster than he'd expected, but it also meant they were becoming more dangerous, more capable of the very behaviors that would seal their fate if discovered. Marcus stepped onto his porch, forcing his expression into one of mild curiosity rather than the panic clawing at his chest. "Sheriff Bradley, unexpected pleasure." Tom's weathered face was grim beneath his winter hat. "Marcus, we need to talk." "Coffee's fresh," Marcus offered, though his tone suggested anything but hospitality. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her breath forming small clouds as she spoke. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen with the State Wildlife Department. We've received reports of wolf activity in this area. Given your history with wildlife, we thought you might have seen something." The weight of that phrase, "your history," hung between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old shame threatening to surface. His past with the Montana Wildlife Research Center hadn't ended well. The incident that destroyed his career, that sent him fleeing to this mountain sanctuary, was exactly the kind of recklessness these people would expect from him. "Haven't seen any wolves," Marcus said, the lie sliding off his tongue with practiced ease. "Plenty of other wildlife, though. Deer, elk, the occasional black bear." The third man, whose name tag read Dr. Williams, Wildlife Control, was scanning the area with professional interest. His gaze lingered on the tree line where the cubs had disappeared. "Mind if we take a look around? We have tracking equipment that might pick up signs you wouldn't notice." Every instinct screamed at Marcus to refuse, to order them off his property, but that would only fuel their suspicions. "Sure," he said instead. "Just watch your step. Terrain's tricky this time of year." As they moved around his cabin, Marcus's mind raced. The cubs were smart, but they were still young. Would they stay hidden? Would they understand the danger these strangers represented? He found himself praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Dr. Chen walked beside him, her equipment beeping softly. "You know, your research on pack dynamics was groundbreaking. She paused delicately, "before you left the field." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago. The techniques you developed for behavioral modification in large predators, they could be invaluable in a situation like this. If there are wolves in the area, relocation would be preferable to elimination." The irony wasn't lost on him. His discredited research, the work that had cost him everything when a modified wolf had killed a rancher's child, might now be the only thing that could save these cubs. But using it would mean revealing what he'd done, what he was still doing. Dr. Williams suddenly stopped, crouching beside a partially covered depression in the snow. "Tom, Sarah, look at this." Marcus's heart hammered as they gathered around what was unmistakably a wolf track, too large to belong to his cubs but clearly fresh. The mother's final journey, preserved in the snow like an accusation. Sheriff Bradley looked up at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "Still haven't seen any wolves?" Before Marcus could answer, a sound froze them all, a low, mournful howl echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. It was answered by two more voices, higher, younger, unmistakably the sound of cubs calling for something they had lost forever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every sound echo across the valley. Marcus stood at his cabin window, watching the three wolf cubs tumble through the fresh powder, their dark forms stark against the white landscape. 2 weeks had passed since their mother's death, and they had grown bolder, more playful, more trusting, too trusting. He pulled away from the window and returned to the kitchen table where Dr. Elena Vasquez sat nursing her third cup of coffee. She'd arrived at dawn, hiking up the treacherous mountain path despite the storm warnings. Her presence here meant only one thing: someone had talked. "You can't keep them, Marcus," she said without looking up from her steaming mug. "Fish and Wildlife is asking questions. There've been reports." Marcus poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate and calm. "Reports of what?" "A man living with wolves, feeding them, protecting them." Elena's dark eyes met his. "You know how this ends. They'll send a team up here, and those cubs will either be relocated or put down." Marcus finished the sentence she couldn't. "The alpha pair from the Clearwater pack was found dead last month, poisoned." Elena's voice carried years of frustration. "Someone's been systematically targeting the wolves in this region. These cubs might be the only survivors of their bloodline." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd suspected as much when the mother wolf had appeared at his door, desperate and dying. Wolves didn't seek out humans unless they had no other choice. "There's something else," Elena continued. "The tissue samples I took from the mother. The toxin in her system wasn't from any standard poison. It was military grade, experimental." The coffee mug slipped from Marcus's hand, shattering against the wooden floor. The sound brought all three cubs to the window, their yellow eyes alert and watching. "Where?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "A compound called VX7, used in biological warfare trials during the late 90s. Elena leaned forward. "Marcus, whoever did this has access to weapons that shouldn't exist anymore. Weapons that were supposedly destroyed after Operation Nightfall." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. "Son of a bitch, you know something about this." It wasn't a question. Elena had always been too perceptive for her own good. That's why he'd trusted her to treat the cubs' injuries, why he'd let her into his carefully constructed isolation. Marcus moved to his bedroom and returned with a metal lockbox. Inside, beneath layers of false documentation and emergency cash, lay a single photograph. He placed it on the table between them. Elena picked up the photo, a group of soldiers in unmarked fatigues standing beside a military transport. A younger Marcus stood third from the left, his face harder, his eyes emptier. "Black Ops Unit," he said. "We were tasked with testing experimental weapons in remote locations. VX7 was one of them. It was designed to target specific genetic markers in wildlife, supposedly for controlling animal populations that threatened military installations." "Jesus Christ, Marcus. What did you do?" "What I was ordered to do." The words tasted like ash, until I realized what we were really testing. The compound wasn't meant for population control. It was being developed as an environmental weapon. Wipe out the wildlife, you destroy the ecosystem. Destroy the ecosystem, you force human populations to relocate. Elena stared at the photograph, her face pale. Who else knew about this? The entire unit was classified. After the program was officially terminated, most of us were reassigned. Some disappeared entirely. Marcus pointed to a figure in the back row, a man with pale eyes and a cruel smile. Except for him, Colonel James Voss. He always believed the program should continue. A howl echoed across the valley, mournful and wild. Both Marcus and Elena turned toward the window, but the cubs were silent, watching something in the distance. "He's found them," Marcus whispered. Through his binoculars, he could see movement on the ridgeline. 3 figures in winter camouflage moving with military precision toward his cabin. They carried specialized weapons, the kind designed for silent kills. "Elena, there's a root cellar behind the woodshed. Take the cubs and hide there. What about you?" Marcus was already moving, pulling weapons from hidden caches throughout the cabin. "I'm going to finish what I should have done 15 years ago. This is insane. We should call for help." "There is no help. Not for this." He handed her a radio. "If you don't hear from me in 1 hour, Use this to contact the Forest Service. Tell them everything." The cubs sensed the danger, their hackles rising as they pressed against the window. The smallest one, the female Marcus had named Luna, let out a soft whine. "They trust you," Elena said. "That's why I have to protect them." Marcus checked his rifle one final time. Someone has to break the cycle. Outside, the figures were closer now, and Marcus could see the face he'd hoped never to see again. Voss had come to finish his work. The radio crackled to life at dawn, jerking Marcus from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Static filled the cabin before clearing into the gruff voice of Ranger Station Alpha. "All units, we have confirmed wolf pack activity in Grid 7. Repeat, confirmed pack activity. Livestock attacks reported at Henderson Ranch. Full search and destroy authorized." Marcus's blood turned to ice. Grid 7 encompassed his territory and extended east toward the valley. He grabbed the radio with trembling fingers. "This is Marcus Cole. What's the timeline on that operation?" "Cole? Thought you were retired. Operation launches at 0800. Why?" Marcus glanced at Luna, who had lifted her massive head at the sound of his voice. The cubs continued sleeping in their makeshift den, oblivious to the death sentence that had just been pronounced. "Just curious about the boundaries. Don't want any surprises up here." "Copy that. Stay indoors today, Cole. These wolves are different, bigger, more aggressive. Something's got them riled up." The transmission ended, leaving Marcus staring at his unlikely family. In 2 hours, armed rangers would sweep through these mountains with one goal: eliminate every wolf they encountered. His mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Luna seemed to sense his distress. She rose gracefully and padded to his side, her yellow eyes meeting his with an intelligence that still unsettled him. For 3 weeks, she'd been recovering her strength, teaching her cubs to hunt small prey in the meadow behind his cabin. The transformation had been remarkable. The dying mother who'd collapsed at his door was now a magnificent predator in her prime. But magnificent predators were exactly what the rangers were hunting. Marcus pulled on his boots and jacket, his movements sharp with urgency. "We need to move," he told Luna, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking aloud. "All of you." As if she understood, Luna immediately went to her cubs, nudging them awake with gentle precision. The 3 young wolves, 2 males and a female, had grown considerably under Marcus's care. They were no longer the helpless creatures who'd huddled against their dying mother, but they weren't yet large enough to survive a concentrated hunt. Marcus threw emergency supplies into his hiking pack: water, dried food, first aid kit, and his father's old service pistol. He'd hoped never to touch the weapon again, but today might demand choices he wasn't ready to make. Outside, the morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers. Marcus led the wolf family north, away from the valley and deeper into the wilderness. Luna flanked her cubs protectively while keeping pace with Marcus's urgent stride. They moved in silence, except for the soft padding of paws on pine needles and Marcus's increasingly labored breathing. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed. Ancient granite formations jutted through the forest floor, creating natural shelters and hidden passages that Marcus remembered from his childhood explorations. His father had brought him here once, teaching him to read the land like a book. "Every mountain has secrets," the old man had said, "but you have to earn the right to know them." Today, those secrets might save lives. They reached a narrow canyon carved between 2 massive rock faces. Marcus had discovered it years ago while tracking an injured deer. The entrance was barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of dense undergrowth. Inside, the canyon opened into a sheltered space with fresh water and enough room for the wolves to move freely. "This is temporary," Marcus explained to Luna as they settled the cubs in the canyon's depths, "just until the heat dies down." Luna watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Then she did something that stopped Marcus cold. She approached the canyon wall where ancient petroglyphs marked the stone, Native American symbols depicting men and wolves, not in conflict but in harmony. Luna placed her paw against one particular image, a human figure standing beside a wolf, both facing the same direction. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. His grandmother had been part Cherokee, and she'd told him stories about the old connections between his family and the wolves of these mountains. Stories he'd dismissed as folklore, until now. The distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the canyon walls. The search had begun. Marcus climbed to a vantage point and counted 3 aircraft circling the area around his cabin. Through binoculars, he watched rangers rappelling from the choppers, armed and methodical. When he returned to the canyon floor, Luna was waiting with an expression he could only describe as expectant. The cubs sat behind her in perfect formation, as if they were soldiers awaiting orders. "What do you want from me?" Marcus whispered. Luna approached the petroglyphs again, this time touching a different symbol with her nose, one that showed a human and wolf merged into a single figure. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, as if a door he'd kept locked his entire life had suddenly opened. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but a deeper instinct, something primal and ancient, whispered a single word: choose. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning silence like a blade through cloth. Marcus pressed himself against the granite outcropping. The wolf cubs huddled beneath his jacket as the aircraft circled overhead. Through the canopy of pine needles, he caught glimpses of the sleek black machine bearing corporate markings he recognized all too well. Nexus Industries had found him. The helicopter made 3 passes before disappearing beyond the ridge, but Marcus knew they would be back with ground teams. He had maybe an hour before they surrounded the mountain. His hands shook as he checked his watch, not from fear, but from the familiar rage that had once made him their most dangerous asset. "Easy, little ones," he whispered to the cubs, who whimpered softly against his chest. Their mother had been dead for 3 days now, buried beneath a cairn of stones beside his cabin. He'd tried to convince himself he could return them to the wild, but they were too young, too dependent. Now, with Nexus closing in, their fate was bound to his. Marcus descended through the forest with practiced stealth, every shadow and depression in the terrain mapped in his memory from years of solitude. But solitude was ending. Dr. Sarah Chen's words echoed in his mind from their encrypted conversation the night before. The Project Lupus files went public. "They know you're alive, Marcus. They know what you took." What he'd taken was more than genetic samples and research data. He'd stolen their entire program, destroyed their lab, and disappeared with the only viable specimens. The wolf cubs sleeping against his heartbeat carried modifications he'd made to their DNA before his escape, enhancements that could revolutionize medicine or create the perfect biological weapon, depending on who controlled them. The sound of engines reached him from the valley road. Black SUVs wound up the mountain highway like mechanical ants following a scent trail. Marcus counted at least 6 vehicles, which meant 18 to 20 operatives. Dr. Aldrich wasn't taking chances this time. Marcus reached the hidden cache he'd prepared years ago for this exact scenario. Behind a false boulder face, steel cases contained everything he needed: weapons, communications equipment, and most importantly, the portable laboratory setup that had taken him months to miniaturize. If Nexus wanted the cubs, they'd have to accept his terms. He activated the satellite phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. Tribune Newsroom. Jennifer Walsh speaking. "This is Dr. Marcus Thorne. I believe you've been looking for me." The pause stretched long enough for Marcus to hear vehicles grinding up the access road below. Finally, Walsh's voice returned, sharp with professional excitement. "Dr. Thorne, we thought you were dead. The Nexus Industries explosion 5 years ago was my resignation letter. Listen carefully, because we don't have much time. I'm sending you coordinates and a data packet that will expose Project Lupus. Everything Nexus has done. Everything they plan to do." Gunfire erupted from the direction of his cabin. Not the sharp crack of assault rifles, but the deep boom of shotguns. Rangers probably, thinking they were dealing with a dangerous hermit. Marcus felt sick knowing those men had no idea what they'd walked into. "The cubs," he murmured, checking the tiny heartbeats against his chest. Both were still alive, still warm. Their enhanced metabolism made them hardier than normal wolves, but they needed food soon. Through his binoculars, Marcus watched tactical teams spread through the forest below. These weren't rangers. Military precision, corporate funding, and the distinctive white body armor that Nexus security favored. Dr. Aldrich had brought his private army. The satellite phone crackled. "Dr. Thorne? Are you there? Dr. Thorne?" "Still here. Upload starting now." His fingers flew across the portable keyboard, transmitting 5 years of carefully documented evidence. Project Lupus, the human trials, the cover-ups, all of it streaming to Tribune's secure servers while Nexus closed their net around him. A flash of movement caught his attention. 3 operatives ascending the ridge to his east, moving with the coordinated precision of wolves hunting prey. Ironic, considering what they'd come to collect. Marcus shouldered his pack and checked his rifle. The cubs stirred restlessly, sensing his tension. One opened golden eyes that held an intelligence no normal wolf possessed, his genetic modifications expressing themselves ahead of schedule. Whatever happened next, they wouldn't be returning to the wild. "Upload complete," Walsh's voice confirmed through the static. "Dr. Thorne, what are you planning to do?" Marcus smiled grimly as he spotted the helicopter returning, this time carrying what looked like a portable laboratory slung beneath its belly. Dr. Aldrich intended to process the cubs on-site, extract what he needed, and eliminate the evidence, including Marcus. "I'm going to show them what their perfect predator program actually created," Marcus said into the phone before crushing it under his boot. The cubs looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Marcus felt the change beginning in his own genetics. Modifications he'd made to himself years ago, dormant until activated by stress and adrenaline. Nexus wanted their monsters back. They were about to get more than they bargained for. The radio crackled to life at dawn, Hayes's voice cutting through the static like a blade. They found the Hendersons' truck abandoned on Fire Ridge Road, blood on the seats but no bodies. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he watched Luna's ears prick up at the tension in his voice. "That's 12 miles south of you, Marcus. Whatever's out there, it's moving closer." Marcus set down the radio and looked at the 3 cubs playing near the fireplace. They'd grown stronger over the past weeks, their movements more coordinated, their eyes bright with intelligence that sometimes unsettled him. Luna sat beside him, her massive frame radiating a protective energy that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. "We can't stay here anymore," he murmured to her, running his fingers through her thick fur. She turned those ancient yellow eyes on him, and he swore he saw understanding there. Not just animal instinct, but something deeper, something that shouldn't exist. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle he'd almost missed it, the way Luna seemed to anticipate his thoughts, how the cubs responded to commands he'd never taught them. The strange dreams that felt more like memories, running through forests on 4 legs, seeing the world through predators' eyes, understanding the complex social bonds of a pack in ways no human should comprehend. Dr. Sarah Chen had warned him about the psychological effects of isolation, but this was different. This was something the scientific community would either dismiss as delusion or, if they believed it, would want to study with a hunger that terrified him. Marcus pulled out his grandfather's journal, the leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling. He'd been avoiding certain passages, the ones that made his rational mind rebel. But now, with Hayes's warning echoing in his ears and Luna's strange intelligence pressing against his consciousness like a living thing, he forced himself to read. "Day 43 with the pack. The boundaries between what I am and what they are grow thinner. Sarah Running Deer was right. The mountain holds power older than our understanding. The wolves know this. They've always known. Today I heard their thoughts as clearly as my own voice." His grandfather's careful script continued. "The transformation isn't physical, though sometimes I wonder if even that barrier might fall. It's deeper, a joining of spirits, of consciousness itself. The pack accepts me not as a human who helps them, but as something new, something between worlds." Marcus's hands trembled as he turned the page. A detailed sketch showed a man standing among wolves, but the man's eyes held the same wild intelligence as the pack around him. Below it, his grandfather had written, "The government men came asking questions about the missing researchers. They'll never understand what really happened. Some boundaries, once crossed, change us forever. Some families are chosen, not born." A low whine from Luna brought Marcus back to the present. She was staring out the window, her body tense. The cubs had stopped playing, their small forms clustered together in a defensive position that spoke of inherited knowledge. Something was wrong. Marcus grabbed his binoculars and scanned the tree line. There, a glint of metal among the pines, then another. Military-grade equipment, which meant government forces. Hayes must have reported their conversation, or someone had been monitoring communications. "They're here," he whispered to Luna, who pressed closer to his side. The connection between them flared stronger, and suddenly Marcus could sense what she sensed. Multiple humans moving through the forest with practiced stealth, surrounding the cabin in a coordinated pattern that spoke of serious training. But there was something else, something that made Luna's hackles rise and sent an electric chill down Marcus's spine. Among the human scents and sounds, there was another predator, something that didn't belong, something wrong. Marcus moved quickly, grabbing his pack and rifle while Luna gathered the cubs with soft growls. The journal went into his jacket pocket. Whatever happened, those secrets couldn't fall into the wrong hands. As he shouldered his gear, one of the cubs, the smallest female, looked up at him with eyes that held far too much understanding. In that moment, Marcus realized the truth his grandfather had discovered. The boundary between human and wolf wasn't just blurring, it was dissolving entirely. The pack bond he felt wasn't metaphorical, it was real, tangible, and growing stronger by the hour. A branch snapped outside, closer than before. Luna's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and Marcus felt his own teeth bare in response. The sensation should have terrified him, but instead it felt right, natural. They moved toward the back door as one unit, predator and human and cubs flowing together with supernatural coordination. Whatever was hunting them had no idea what they were truly facing. The old Marcus might have tried to negotiate, to find a peaceful solution. But the old Marcus was disappearing, replaced by something fiercer, something wild, something that would protect this pack at any cost. The helicopter's rotors churned the mountain air into a violent maelstrom as Marcus crouched behind the fallen pine, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the whipping branches, he could see the aircraft's searchlight sweeping across the clearing where his cabin stood. The cubs pressed against his legs, their small bodies trembling with fear at the mechanical thunder above. He had perhaps minutes before they landed. The radio chatter he'd intercepted earlier left no doubt about their intentions. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her team weren't coming for a friendly reunion. They knew about the serum, knew what he'd done to himself, and they wanted both him and the wolves as specimens. "Easy," he whispered to the cubs, his enhanced hearing picking up their rapid heartbeats beneath the helicopter noise. The wolf DNA coursing through his system had sharpened every sense to an almost painful degree. He could smell the aviation fuel, the metal of the aircraft, even the fear sweat of the occupants inside. The helicopter touched down with a heavy thud that shook the ground. Through the settling dust, Marcus watched 4 figures emerge in tactical gear, their movements coordinated and efficient. Vasquez led them, her silver hair pulled back severely, a tranquilizer rifle in her hands. Behind her came 2 men Marcus didn't recognize, followed by someone who made his blood run cold. Dr. James Holloway, his former research partner, the man who'd helped design the very serum now transforming Marcus's cellular structure. Spread out, Vasquez's voice carried clearly to Marcus's enhanced ears. "Remember, we need him alive. The subject has likely experienced significant neurological changes. Approach with extreme caution." Subject. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. After everything they'd shared, everything they'd discovered together, she still saw him as nothing more than a lab experiment gone wrong. The cubs whimpered softly, and Marcus felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. These weren't just animals anymore. They were family, the last remnant of their mother's desperate trust in him. He wouldn't let Vasquez turn them into test subjects, wouldn't let her cage them for her research. Moving with a fluidity that still surprised him, Marcus began circling wide around the clearing. His body felt different now, more compact, more aware of the terrain beneath his feet. The enhanced muscles in his legs absorbed each step silently, while his modified nervous system processed the environment with wolf-like efficiency. He could track each team member's location by scent alone. Holloway was moving toward the back of the cabin, his cologne a sharp note against the pine and earth. The two tactical specialists had split off, one heading for the workshop where Marcus kept his research equipment, the other moving to flank the tree line where Marcus currently hid. Vasquez approached the front door, her steps measured and confident. She called out, her voice carrying an authority that once would have made Marcus hesitate. "Marcus, I know you're here. Your transformation is remarkable, but it's also dangerous. You need medical supervision, proper monitoring. Think about what you're becoming." What he was becoming. Marcus felt his lips pull back in something that wasn't quite a smile. She had no idea what he'd gained, what he'd chosen. The serum hadn't just altered his body, it had opened his mind to connections he'd never imagined possible. He could feel the forest around him like an extension of his own nervous system, could sense the cub's emotional states as clearly as his own. The tactical specialist nearest to him stepped into a patch of loose scree, and Marcus moved. The enhanced reflexes kicked in before conscious thought, and suddenly he was behind the man, one arm locked around his throat in a sleeper hold. The man dropped without a sound, his tranquilizer rifle clattering onto the rocks. Marcus snatched up the weapon and checked the load. Enough darts for the remaining 3 team members, but he'd have to be precise. The cubs had followed him silently, their movements now synchronized with his own, as if they shared some deeper communication. Henderson's not responding, he heard one of the remaining men report through the radio. Vasquez's voice crackled back, tension creeping into her professional calm. "Tighten the perimeter. He's more capable than we anticipated." More capable. Marcus almost laughed at the understatement. The serum had done far more than enhance his physical attributes. It had fundamentally rewired his relationship with the world around him. He could feel the mountain's rhythms, understand the cub's simple communications, sense danger with an instinct that transcended human experience. But with that transformation came a terrible clarity about what Vasquez represented. She saw only the scientific implications, the potential applications for human enhancement. She couldn't understand that what he'd become wasn't an improvement on humanity. It was something entirely new. The largest cub nudged against his hand, and Marcus felt its trust flow through him like warm current. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let them take his new family back to the sterile laboratories and observation cages. Some transformations were meant to be protected, not studied. Marcus raised the tranquilizer rifle and began to hunt. The helicopters circled like mechanical vultures against the grey dawn sky, their rotors beating a rhythm that made Marcus's chest tighten with familiar dread. He crouched behind the fallen pine, watching 3 aircraft maintain their search pattern over the valley below. They'd been at it for an hour now, methodically combing every ridge and clearing. Luna pressed against his leg, her amber eyes fixed on the sky. The cubs huddled beneath a rocky overhang 20 yards away, their dark fur barely visible in the shadows. They'd learned to stay hidden when the machines came, an instinct that shouldn't exist in creatures so young. Marcus checked his watch. The helicopters would need to refuel soon, giving them a window to move. But where? Every safe house he'd ever known was compromised now. The faces on those surveillance photos had made that clear. Someone had connected the dots between his old life and his new one, and they were closing the net with military precision. His satellite phone buzzed once against his hip. A text message. His blood ran cold as he read the coordinates. They were for his cabin, followed by a timestamp from yesterday and a single word. Interesting. They'd found his home. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the access road below. Marcus belly-crawled to a better vantage point and counted 4 black SUVs winding their way up the mountain. Through his binoculars, he could make out armed figures in tactical gear, not park rangers or wildlife officials. These were contractors, the kind his former employers used when they needed things done quietly. Luna whined softly, sensing his tension. Marcus placed a calming hand on her neck, feeling the powerful muscles coiled beneath her fur. She'd grown stronger in the weeks since her mother's death, but she was still young, still vulnerable. The cubs were even more so. A memory surfaced unbidden. Another mountain, another time. A village in Afghanistan, where he'd been tasked with extracting a high-valued target. The mission had gone sideways when they'd discovered the target had a family, children. Marcus had made a choice that day that ended his career and nearly ended his life. He'd chosen to protect the innocent rather than complete the mission. Now he faced a similar choice, but the stakes felt even higher. The lead helicopter banked toward their position, its searchlight sweeping across the tree line despite the growing daylight. Marcus pulled the cubs deeper into the shadows and checked his rifle. 14 rounds left. Against this kind of force, it might as well be a slingshot. But he wasn't the same man who'd fled into these mountains 5 years ago. Living with the wolves had changed him, in ways he was still discovering. Luna had taught him patience. The cubs had reminded him of joy, and their mother's sacrifice had shown him what true courage looked like. The helicopter passed overhead, close enough that he could see the pilot's face, close enough that thermal imaging would have detected them if they'd been looking in the right spot. They weren't yet, but it was only a matter of time. Marcus made his decision. He pulled out a small device he'd hoped never to use again, a beacon that would signal his old handler, the one person who might still honor the deals they'd made in darker times. Pressing it meant revealing his location to people who wanted him dead, but it also meant accessing resources he'd need to protect his new family. The beacon's single red light pulsed once and went dark. Luna watched him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, as if she understood the weight of what he'd just done. Marcus scratched behind her ears, remembering the night she'd first trusted him enough to eat from his hand. Trust. That's what this all came down to. The wolves had trusted him to protect them, and he wouldn't let them down. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, the number blocked. Marcus hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Marcus." The voice belonged to Colonel Elizabeth Hayes, his former commanding officer and the closest thing he'd ever had to a friend in that world. "Interesting company you're keeping these days, Liz." He kept his voice neutral. "I was wondering when you'd surface. We need to talk, face to face. Kind of busy right now." Another helicopter swept past, lower this time. "I can see that. Marcus, there are forces in motion here that are bigger than your personal vendetta against the program. Those wolves, they're not just animals anymore, are they?" Marcus felt Luna tense beside him. The colonel knew more than she was letting on. "What do you want, Liz?" "To offer you a choice. Come in willingly, and we can discuss terms. Continue running, and—" She paused as one of the helicopters banked sharply toward their position. "Well, you know how this ends." The searchlight found them, blazing white and merciless. Luna bared her teeth at the sky while the cubs pressed deeper into the rocks. Marcus shouldered his rifle and smiled grimly. "Actually, Liz, I don't think you have any idea how this ends." The coordinates led them deeper into the Yukon wilderness than Marcus had ever ventured, even during his darkest years of self-imposed exile. The GPS device Dr. Chen had given him beeped steadily as they moved through terrain that seemed untouched by human presence for decades. Behind him, the 3 cubs followed with an alertness that made his skin crawl. They moved like they knew exactly where they were going. Sarah struggled to keep pace, her breath coming in sharp puffs in the sub-zero air. "Marcus, we need to talk about what we're really walking into." He didn't slow down. The coordinates were burned into his memory now, 64.7731 degree N, 140.8719 degree W. The same numbers his handler had whispered to him 23 years ago, right before everything went to hell. The facility was supposed to be destroyed, he said, more to himself than to her. What facility? Sarah grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. You've been keeping something from me since we left the cabin. The cubs circled them, their enhanced intelligence evident in how they positioned themselves, creating a perimeter, watching for threats. Luna pressed against his leg, and for a moment he felt that strange connection again, like static electricity in his mind. Project Wildfire, he said finally. It wasn't just about creating super soldiers. The real goal was consciousness transfer, moving human intelligence into animal hosts. Sarah's face went pale. That's impossible. Is it? Marcus watched as Kodiak lifted his head, sniffing the air with methodical precision. Look at them, Sarah. Really look at them. They're not just smart. They're thinking like humans. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Oh my God, the mother wolf. She wasn't bringing you her cubs for protection. She was bringing them to you specifically. Marcus nodded grimly. Someone wanted me to find them. Someone who knows who I really am. They resumed walking, following a game trail that gradually widened into something more deliberate. Old tire tracks, barely visible under years of snowfall and regrowth. The landscape began to change, becoming more geometric. Hidden among the natural rock formations, Marcus spotted the telltale signs of camouflaged structures. There, he pointed to what looked like a natural cliff face. Blast doors. As they approached, the cubs became agitated. Storm began to whine, a sound that didn't belong to any animal Marcus knew. Luna pressed closer to him, and suddenly his mind filled with images, not his own memories, but something else entirely. Flashes of sterile corridors, men in lab coats, the sensation of being trapped, helpless. They remember this place, Sarah whispered, watching the cubs' behavior. A mechanical whir echoed across the clearing. The cliff face split open, revealing a tunnel entrance lit by emergency lighting. No one had activated it from inside. The cubs' presence alone had triggered some kind of automated system. Biometric scanners, Marcus realized. They're coded to recognize the cubs. As they entered the tunnel, motion sensors brought additional lights online, revealing the scope of the installation. This wasn't the crude military outpost Marcus remembered from his briefings. This was something far more sophisticated, carved deep into the mountain itself. The main laboratory stretched out before them like a cathedral of science fiction horror. Rows of empty containment units lined the walls, their glass surfaces fogged with condensation. Computer terminals hummed with activity, displaying streams of data that had been running for years, maybe decades. Jesus, Sarah breathed. How is this place still operational? Marcus studied the readouts, his training in covert operations allowing him to pass the technical information. Automated systems, self-maintaining. Someone designed this to run indefinitely. At the center of the lab, 3 specific containment units drew their attention, larger than the others, with specialized equipment that Marcus didn't recognize. Placards on each unit bore names: Luna 7, Storm 12, Kodiak 15. The cubs approached their former prisons without fear, pressing their noses against the glass. Luna looked back at Marcus, and again he felt that electric connection in his mind. But this time it was clearer, more focused. Images flooded his consciousness. Dr. Miranda Chen, 20 years younger, working frantically at these same terminals, evacuation alarms blaring. And then a face Marcus recognized from his nightmares. Colonel Harrison Webb, his former commanding officer, the man who'd ordered the massacre that ended Marcus's military career. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. Dr. Chen didn't just happen to find us. She's been part of this from the beginning. A slow clap echoed through the laboratory. They spun around to find Dr. Chen stepping out from behind one of the computer banks, no longer the concerned veterinarian they thought they knew. Very good, Marcus, she said, though it took you longer to piece it together than I expected. 23 years of hiding in the mountains must have dulled those legendary instincts. Sarah stepped protectively in front of Marcus. Who are you really? Dr. Chen smiled. and it was nothing like the warm expression they'd grown accustomed to. Dr. Miranda Chen, former head of neurological research for Project Wildfire, and the woman who's been waiting a very long time to complete her life's work. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a death knell, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus pressed his back against the cave wall, feeling the cold stone through his jacket as he watched the aircraft circle overhead. Beside him, the three wolves, no longer cubs but not yet fully grown, shifted restlessly, their ears pinned back against the thunderous noise. "They're not giving up," he muttered, checking the ammunition in his rifle. The tranquilizer darts scattered across the forest floor below told the story of yesterday's failed capture attempt. Dr. Elizabeth Crane's team had come prepared for wolves, not for a man who understood their every instinct and movement. The radio clipped to his belt crackled to life. "Marcus, I know you can hear me." Elizabeth's voice was strained, professional mask slipping. "We have the cave surrounded. There's nowhere left to run." He almost laughed at the irony. 3 months ago, he'd been the one doing the surrounding, leading capture teams through these same mountains. Now he was the hunted, branded a traitor by the very organization that had created him. The largest wolf, the one he'd named Storm for the lightning-shaped marking on her forehead, nudged his hand with her muzzle. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that still startled him, awareness that went beyond normal animal instinct. The experimental serum that had saved them as dying cubs had done more than just preserve their lives. It had fundamentally altered them, just as it had altered him decades ago when he'd been Elizabeth's first test subject. "I know, girl," he whispered, scratching behind her ears. "We have to move." The other two wolves, Shadow and Frost, flanked him as he moved deeper into the cave system. These tunnels had been his refuge for 15 years, ever since he'd faked his death and escaped the laboratory. Every passage, every hidden exit was burned into his memory. But Elizabeth knew him too well. She'd been there when they'd enhanced his cognitive abilities, when they'd pushed his physical limits beyond human norms. She understood that conventional tactics wouldn't work against him. The radio crackled again. "You can't protect them forever, Marcus. The serum is unstable. Without proper medical supervision, they'll die anyway, just like you're dying." Marcus touched his chest where the latest symptoms had appeared, dark veins spreading beneath his skin like ink in water. The enhancements that had given him strength and speed were finally breaking down his cellular structure. He had months, maybe weeks left. But the wolves, they were different. Younger when treated, their bodies had adapted to the serum in ways his never could. They weren't dying, they were evolving. A distant rumble echoed through the cave as explosives detonated near the main entrance. Elizabeth was sealing off escape routes, forcing him toward the deeper tunnels where her teams waited. It was a good strategy, one he'd taught her years ago. Storm suddenly stiffened, her hackles rising as she stared into the darkness ahead. Marcus heard it too, the soft scrape of boots on stone, the whispered communications of the tactical team. They'd found the rear entrance. 4 men, he breathed, his enhanced hearing picking up heartbeats, breathing patterns, the slight squeak of tactical gear. Armed with tranquilizers and live rounds, the wolves spread out instinctively, moving with a coordination that defied their youth. The serum hadn't just enhanced their intelligence, it had created a pack bond that transcended normal wolf behavior. They moved as one mind in 3 bodies, and somehow, impossibly, Marcus could feel that connection extending to him. The first soldier rounded the corner just as Storm leaped from the shadows. Her movements were fluid, too fast for normal reflexes. The man's tranquilizer gun fired harmlessly into the cave wall as 90 pounds of enhanced wolf drove him to the ground. Shadow and Frost moved simultaneously, flanking the remaining soldiers with tactical precision that would have impressed any military unit. These weren't wild animals acting on instinct. They were intelligent predators executing a coordinated strategy. Marcus emerged from concealment as the last soldier fell unconscious, having been overwhelmed by creatures that moved like ghosts and struck like lightning. The wolves had been careful not to inflict serious injury, understanding somehow that these men were just following orders. "We need to reach the valley," Marcus said, collecting the soldiers' equipment. "There's something there Elizabeth doesn't know about." Storm tilted her head, and Marcus felt that strange connection pulse between them. Images flashed through his mind. Not his memories, but somehow shared knowledge. The mother wolf who had brought her dying cubs to his door hadn't chosen him randomly. She'd known exactly who he was, what he could do for her offspring. Because she'd been enhanced too, part of an earlier experiment that Elizabeth had deemed a failure. But the female had escaped, bred, and passed something incredible to her cubs. Something that made them the key to everything. The helicopter's rotors grew distant as Marcus and the wolves slipped through a hidden fissure in the cave wall. They had one advantage Elizabeth couldn't account for. They weren't running away anymore. They were going home. The helicopter's rotors cut through the mountain air with mechanical precision, but Marcus barely heard them anymore. His focus remained locked on the tranquilizer dart protruding from Luna's flank as she lay unconscious in the makeshift transport cage. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and the 3 cubs pressed against her still form, whimpering softly. Dr. Sarah Chen worked with practiced efficiency in the cramped space, monitoring Luna's vital signs while keeping one eye on the cubs. "Heart rate stabilizing," she called over the engine noise. "But we need to get her into surgery within the hour." Marcus nodded grimly, his weathered hands gripping the cage bars. The decision to trust these strangers with Luna's life went against every instinct he'd developed over 15 years of isolation. Yet watching her condition deteriorate through the night had left him no choice. The infection from her old wounds was spreading faster than his limited medical supplies could handle. "You did the right thing calling us," Sarah continued, adjusting the 4 lines she'd managed to establish. "Most people would have just let nature take its course." "Most people aren't responsible for what happened to her pack in the first place," Marcus replied quietly. Sarah's hands paused momentarily before resuming their work. She'd heard rumors about the reclusive mountain man who'd contacted the Wildlife Rescue Service, whispers about his past with the Forest Service and why he'd disappeared from civilization. But seeing him now, the pain etched deep in his features as he watched over these wolves, she understood this was about more than simple guilt. The helicopter banked sharply as they approached the valley where the mobile veterinary unit waited. Marcus could see the collection of vehicles and equipment scattered across the meadow below, looking alien against the pristine wilderness backdrop. Dr. James Wright, whom Sarah had described as the best wildlife surgeon in 3 states, stood ready beside an operating table that had been assembled under a large canopy. "Landing in 30 seconds, the pilot announced. "Medical team, prepare for immediate transfer." As they touched down, Marcus felt the cub's nervous energy spike. Shadow, the boldest of the 3, actually growled at the approaching figures despite his small size. Marcus reached into the cage, allowing the young wolf to sniff his familiar scent. "Easy, little one," he murmured. "These people want to help." The transfer happened with choreographed efficiency. Within minutes, Luna was on the operating table while Wright examined her under bright surgical lights. His expression grew increasingly grave as he assessed the damage. "Massive systemic infection," he announced to his team. "Multiple untreated fractures that healed improperly. Severe muscle atrophy from compensating for injured limbs." "How long has she been like this?" "Months, maybe longer," Marcus answered. "She was protecting her cubs, pushing herself beyond what her body could handle." Wright looked up from his examination. "Mr. Thorne, I need you to understand something. Even if we can beat the infection, she may never fully recover. The damage to her skeletal structure is extensive. She might not survive the surgery at all." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. After everything Luna had endured, after bringing her cubs to him in a final desperate act of trust, was it all for nothing? "But you'll try," he said. It wasn't a question. "Of course. Sarah, prep the anesthesia. We're going to be here a while." As the medical team began their work, Marcus found himself relegated to observer status. The cubs had been moved to a smaller enclosure nearby, and he sat beside them, watching through the mesh as Wright and his assistants fought to save their mother. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now depending on the same wildlife management system he'd once served, the same bureaucracy that had ignored his warnings about the helicopter culling operation 15 years ago. Shadow approached the cage wall and pressed his nose against Marcus's outstretched finger. The young wolf's trust was absolute, born from weeks of shared meals and protection in the cabin. But trust was a fragile thing, Marcus knew. It could be shattered in an instant by forces beyond anyone's control. "Her vitals are dropping," Sarah called out suddenly. "Blood pressure's falling fast." Marcus stood abruptly, his heart hammering as he watched Wright work frantically over Luna's still form. The surgeon's hands moved with desperate precision, but Marcus could see the growing tension in his shoulders. "Come on," Marcus whispered, pressing closer to the operating area. "Don't give up now, not after coming this far." The cubs sensed the shift in atmosphere and began pacing restlessly in their enclosure. Their soft whines carried across the meadow, a mournful sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Wright's voice cut through the tension. "I'm losing her." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling 15 years of guilt and regret crushing down on him. Luna had trusted him with everything that mattered to her, and he was about to fail her just as he'd failed her pack all those years ago. But then Shadow's determined howl pierced the air, young but fierce, calling to his mother with every ounce of strength in his small body. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a mechanical scythe, its shadow racing across the snow-covered peaks below. Marcus gripped the radio with white knuckles, his weathered face etched with lines of desperation that had deepened over the past 3 days. "Base camp, this is Search 7. Still no visual on the target. Weather's closing in fast from the northwest." The pilot's voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the engine's roar. Marcus pressed the transmit button. "Keep looking, damn it. He's out there somewhere." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent wound. The storm that had swept through 2 nights ago had been brutal, dumping 4 feet of fresh powder and erasing any trace of the path Thomas Blackwood might have taken. The old man had vanished into the wilderness as if he'd never existed, taking the 3 wolf cubs with him. Down in the valley, the media circus had only grown more frenzied. News vans lined the mountain access road like a mechanical plague, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like desperate prayers. The story had exploded beyond anything Marcus could have imagined. The wolf whisperer, they were calling him now, the man who could speak to predators, who had somehow formed an impossible bond with creatures that should have torn him apart. Dr. Sarah Chen stood beside Marcus at the makeshift command post, her tablet displaying thermal imaging data that told them nothing they wanted to hear. "The heat signatures we picked up yesterday turned out to be a family of deer," she said quietly. "And the tracks the ground team found this morning were too old, probably from before the storm." Marcus stared at the satellite map spread across the folding table, its topographical lines blurring together like a puzzle with too many pieces. Red X's marked the areas they'd already searched, an ever-growing constellation of failure that seemed to mock their efforts. "He doesn't want to be found," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Can you blame him?" Sarah's voice carried a weight of understanding that surprised him. "Look at what we've done to his story, to his life." On the tablet screen, she pulled up one of the news articles that had been proliferating like wildfire across social media. The headlines screamed sensationalism, modern-day Mowgli raises wolf pack, man or beast, the shocking truth, government cover-up in the mountains. Each story grew more outlandish than the last, transforming Thomas from a complex, troubled man into a mythical figure that bore no resemblance to reality. The radio crackled again. "Base camp, we're getting some interference up here. Magnetic anomaly about 2 clicks northeast of Sector 7. Could be equipment malfunction, but thought you should know." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Sector 7 was deep wilderness, accessible only by foot or helicopter, the kind of place a man might go if he wanted to disappear forever. What kind of interference? Hard to say. Instruments are going haywire. GPS is spinning like a compass near a magnet. Weather radar shows, well, it shows something that can't be right. Sarah looked up from her tablet, eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? The pilot's voice grew uncertain. According to these readings, there's some kind of atmospheric disturbance down there. Temperature variations that shouldn't be possible. It's like the air itself is different. Marcus grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, suddenly energized by the first real lead they'd had in days. Can you set us down nearby? Negative. Wind shear is too dangerous in this weather, but I can drop you at the ridgeline about a mile out. You'd have to hike in on foot. Do it. Sarah caught his arm as he headed for the helicopter. Marcus, this could be nothing. Equipment failure, atmospheric pressure changes from the storm, or it could be him. Marcus pulled free, his jaw set with determination. Thomas Blackwood isn't just some hermit who got lucky with a few wolf cubs. There's something about that man, something we don't understand. The way those animals responded to him, the way they trusted him completely. I've never seen anything like it. As they lifted off, Marcus pressed his face to the window, watching the landscape scroll past beneath them. Somewhere in that vast expanse of white, Thomas was out there with the cubs. But the more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized they weren't just searching for a missing person anymore. The electromagnetic readings, the atmospheric disturbances, the impossible bond between man and wolf, it all pointed to something beyond their current understanding. And as the helicopter banked towards Sector 7, fighting against wind gusts that seemed to come from nowhere, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying towards something that would change everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The mountain waited below, keeping its secrets locked beneath layers of snow and silence. The helicopters circled like mechanical vultures against the dawn sky, their rotors churning the mountain air into chaos. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the federal agents descend on ropes, their boots hitting the ground with military precision. Behind him, the three wolves waited in the shadows of the cabin, their amber eyes tracking every movement. "Dr. Marcus Whitmore," Agent Sarah Chen called out as she approached, her weapon holstered but her hand resting on the grip. "We need to talk." Marcus didn't move. After 17 years of hiding, 17 years of silence, the reckoning had finally come. "I suppose you do." The largest of the cubs, now nearly full-grown, stepped forward with a low growl. Marcus placed his hand on the wolf's head, feeling the tension ripple through its powerful frame. "Easy, Storm. They're not here for you." Chen's eyes widened as she took in the scene, the massive wolves standing protectively beside the man, showing no fear of the armed agents surrounding them. The reports were true then. "You really did it." "I did a lot of things," Marcus said quietly. "You'll have to be more specific." "Project Genesis, the genetic integration protocols. We found Dr. Elizabeth Kane's files." Chen pulled out a tablet, her fingers swiping through classified documents. She documented everything before she died. The failed experiments, the breakthroughs, and your final test subject. Marcus felt the weight of the past crushing down on him like an avalanche. Elizabeth, his partner, his conscience, his anchor to humanity. She'd tried to stop him in those final days when the obsession had consumed him completely. "Yourself," Chen continued. "You injected yourself with the serum, didn't you? That's how you survived out here alone. That's how you could communicate with them." The memories flooded back, the burning sensation as the modified DNA rewrote his cellular structure, the agony of his body adapting, the terrifying moment when he first heard the dying mother wolf's thoughts as clearly as spoken words. She hadn't just brought her cubs to his doorstep by chance. She'd sensed the wolf in him, the predator hiding beneath human skin. "The project was supposed to create super soldiers," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "Enhanced humans with animal instincts and abilities. But Elizabeth was right. We were playing God with forces we didn't understand." Storm pressed closer to Marcus, and suddenly the other agents tensed as more wolves emerged from the forest. Not just 3 cubs, but an entire pack. A dozen pairs of eyes gleamed in the morning light, surrounding the clearing. "Jesus," one of the agents whispered, raising his rifle. "Don't," Marcus commanded, and his voice carried an authority that made every human freeze. "They won't hurt you unless you threaten them. Or me." Chen's hand moved away from her weapon. "How many others know about this? About what you've become?" "Just Elizabeth," and she took the secret to her grave. Marcus looked at the woman who'd tracked him down after nearly 2 decades. "How did you find me?" Satellite imagery picked up thermal signatures that didn't match known wildlife patterns. Then we started investigating the decreased poaching activity in this region, the unusual pack behavior. Chen paused. "You've been protecting them, haven't you?" "The entire ecosystem." Marcus nodded slowly. The enhanced senses, the ability to understand their language, the gradual acceptance by the pack. It had given him a purpose beyond his guilt and shame. He'd become something between human and wolf, a guardian bridging 2 worlds. "The question is," Chen said, stepping closer despite the growling pack, "what happens now? You're technically a war criminal. The genetic modifications, the unauthorized human testing—" "I know what I am," Marcus cut her off. "But these wolves, this pack, they're innocent. They've built something here, a balance that took years to achieve." Storm nudged Marcus's hand, and he felt the wolf's thoughts as clearly as his own. Trust, pack, protect. The simple concepts that had become his life's meaning. Chen studied the interaction, her analytical mind processing what she witnessed. The applications could be revolutionary, medical breakthroughs, conservation efforts. "No," Marcus's voice carried the finality of winter. "That road leads nowhere good. I learned that lesson 17 years too late." The pack leader, a massive grey wolf Marcus had named Shadow, padded into the clearing. The federal agents instinctively stepped back as the alpha approached Marcus, touched his muzzle to the man's hand, then turned to face Chen directly. In that moment, Chen understood. This wasn't about capturing a fugitive scientist or studying an illegal experiment. This was about recognizing something unprecedented, a harmony between species that shouldn't exist but somehow did. "We could make this official," she said finally. "A wildlife sanctuary, protected status. You could stay, continue your work, but under proper oversight." Marcus looked at the wolves surrounding him, his family forged in loss and acceptance. For the first time in 17 years, he allowed himself to hope. "I'd like that," he whispered, as Storm's howl echoed across the mountains, calling the pack home.